So going direct to business, I would like to pick your brain on what you think about the current state of globalization. In particular, everyone is speaking about deglobalization, decoupling, and a big disruption happening. I would like to know what you think about that.
So what I'm really interested in finding out and exploring further is why is it that people are so surprised by what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. So we've seen, as you said, decoupling. We've seen a technological war now between the US and China. We've seen a physical war between Ukraine and NATO uh, behind it and Russia. And it seems to have taken people by surprise. And I have argued in various other forums that actually there are four main illusions that people have worked with all those years. So
Okay,
the,
let's hear these four illusions. What are
so the
they?
first one is really the illusion of technology preeminence.
Okay.
People have, especially in the US, believe that technology is actually the main and principal source of competitive advantage. And they have totally ignored the fact that just technology by itself does not actually assure profitability. To be able to enter a foreign market, you must also line up complementary inputs. For example, you must have access to consumers. It's increasingly, there is like an uneven playing field here because it has become increasingly easy to get technology, but it has become increasingly difficult to get access to complementary assets in countries such as China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, and the like.
What are these complementary assets?
So, complementary assets is, for example, natural resources, it's access to labor, right? The labor force. It's also and especially access to consumers. So for countries which are, for example, entering China to sell to Chinese customers, I think of Volkswagen, for example, uh, access to consumers is really crucial. But access to consumers is very often monopolized by local firms. The best example of that, if I take a Chinese example, the best example of that is Haier or it's Huawei, right? Who basically manage to have a very efficient distribution system. And this distribution, and once you have this distribution system, you can actually either trade it in exchange for technology in joint ventures, or you can just monetize it by basically overcharging the Western multinational. With the money that you make from overcharging, you can then buy technology.
Okay.
And the market for technology in the West, I mean, there is a basic imbalance because when we're talking about emerging markets, uh, we were talking about typically a relationship-based system. When we're talking about Western markets, we're talking about a rule-based system. And all you have to do is think about how easy it is to buy a Western firm, which are typically specialized, right? As opposed to buy a Chinese firm, which is usually diversified into things no one
Yes.
wants, like schools, like, I mean, there's a textile firm that actually owns an aluminum business, right? So all of that is very difficult to do. In the West, it's very easy to do. So
Yeah, I mean,
Chinese
you
firm,
mentioned you mentioned Haier, which is the
higher,
leading white goods
yes,
manufacturer in the
yes,
world by now,
yes,
I
in
think.
the world, yes,
And I know, being Italian, I know that they have purchased several of the Italian companies that had technology and patents in washing machines,
yep,
fridges, and so
yep,
on. And so it became part of their. They bought the technology
yes,
exactly,
yes.
following the process
Yeah.
that you
I mean,
described.
and then if you think about the difference between catching up with the technology as opposed to innovating technology, catching up with technology, imitating technology means you are basically cutting out all the risk and all the false starts that you have with innovating. And so the Chinese, I mean, you go to the streets in Shanghai or Guangzhou, even smaller places, and you find sellers of sweet potatoes, hot sweet potatoes, and all they have is a QR code, right? So people pay from their mobile phone wallets. So if you compare this to the
Wow.
US when they still have checks, right?
Yeah.
You
Well, U.S.,
realize,
Europe, and everywhere
well,
else.
Europe, Netherlands doesn't have checks anymore, but the
Uh,
US. So that's the first illusion. The second
Second illusion.
illusion is the illusion of convergence. And the illusion of convergence comes from the fact that people have mistook the superficial adherence to what has been called the Washington Consensus, which is kind of a set of rules imposed on the world by the US. They have basically misread this superficial adherence to actually an acceptance of the rules. So if you think, for example, of the Chinese, they wanted to be part of the WTO, but they never intended to actually abide by the rules of WTO, right? A very good example of that is the privatization of Vale in Brazil, right? So the Brazilian government did not want any of the existing major mining companies to own Vale. And so they basically maneuvered such that only Brazilian companies were the main buyers of the stock of Vale. The Brazilian government kept a dominating share. And the only foreigners that are owners of Vale are a small group of Japanese trading companies who are buying the iron ore, but very, very limited, right? So they pretended to play the WTO game, but they never intended to. The third one, I think, the third illusion is maybe what we could call the illusion of engagement. And the idea
You
is
mean
that
political engagement?
that economic engagement will lead to political convergence.
Okay, yes.
And so this is of course the Germans were very big with that.
Yeah.
The Ostpolitik, or what they call it, Wandel durch Handel, change through commerce. But the big illusion here is the fact that the only cases where economic interaction has led to convergence of the political system is when the alignment of political system was an explicit goal. And if you look at the European community, yes, the European community has achieved convergence in political system as well as integration in the economic system, but because this is a condition for adhesion.
But wouldn't you argue that even within the European Union it's getting harder to have this convergence working? I mean, with people like Orban, kind of.
But what has happened?
Democracy.
It's a struggle, but the EU has levers, and as you know,
Yes.
Orban hasn't gotten a cent from the COVID subsidies, and so sooner, and of course, Orban used to, maybe it's not very polite to say, Orban used to get the EU funds basically to shower his friends, right? So part of the whole thing was done.
Well,
so
there's been
now
a big investigation, actually by the New York Times, I believe, on how the use of European funds to strengthen his grip on power by granting land, fertile land, and European subsidies to people in the same
to
circle
people
of power.
in his
But I
Fidesz
guess
party.
my point is that even within the European Union, which has funds and it has a big market, it has a lot of leverage with people like Orban, it's difficult.
It's still
even
difficult.
then it's difficult.
Yes.
Then with a big economy like China, which is not tied by a unifying political project, it's not just difficult. I don't think it's possible because nowadays not even the US has much leverage in imposing rules.
Zero leverage.
It's
but
impossible.
if you think of Russia, the Germans really believed, and at some point it seemed possible, right? That actually the Soviets, Russia would become much more similar to a Western type of democracy. But of course, this hasn't happened, as we know. And in the case of China, the Western democracies have zero leverage on what happens in China. The last one, I think, which is also quite disappointing to many people, is maybe the illusion of rationality. And it's the illusion in thinking that if the economic interests of the parties converge, then they in fact will engage in a similar project. The best example, I can think of two major examples. One example is World War I. As you know, not only was the UK and Germany linked by very tight economic links, but of course, the Kaiser was a cousin of the King of England, right? So family ties,
trade,
economic, very
financial links.
very heavy financial line, and yet World War I, right? The equivalent, I think, is Brexit, right?
Yeah.
A great deal for the UK, I mean, the EU, they got all those exemptions. They had, they didn't have to do so many things. It was a wonderful deal that they managed to get. And they basically shot themselves in the foot. Because now I think they are not getting any new investment. But I think also psychologically, lots of good people have left the UK, and psychologically we are basically, I think the mentality has gone back to small England, and so it's a disaster. Why a disaster? Because the gains of globalization are unevenly distributed,
Yes.
and political systems typically exaggerate this problem because they tend to overrepresent areas, rural areas as opposed to urban areas. In the U.S., the typical story in the U.S. is that, the Senate has 2 senators per country, and so Wyoming, which has, I think, don't quote me on this, 400,000 people, has 2 senators, the same thing as California, which has 10 million people, right? So that overrepresentation of rural areas, which end up being the places where the non-ambitious people have stayed, because the ambitious people have left those areas, tend to be very much against globalization, and the result is Brexit.
Thank you, Professor Hennart, for coming all the way from the Netherlands to here, bringing us a piece of European wisdom and knowledge, and we truly appreciate it. And thank you for your 4 illusions of why people are surprised about the disruption that is happening in the global economy and its political drivers at the moment.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
We hope to see you again. Thank you.